At first glance, the odds of some sort of deal between Iran and the US looks pretty low. The two sides' negotiating positions are miles apart. Both sides seem to think that they're winning, and last week's mini-deal, where the Iranians apparently agreed to completely open the strait, lasted barely a day. However, while it's true that the politics of any deal are immensely difficult, in large part because neither side is willing to lose face, when it comes to the actual substance of a deal, it's surprisingly easy to see some potential landing zones. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some outstanding points of disagreement, and explain why they might not be as insurmountable as they look. Is social media as dangerous as alcohol? While you might instinctively say no, there's a historical precedent that suggests social media bans for children might be a necessary move. Read our thoughts on the debate gaining traction across the world in the latest edition of Our magazine. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, as we see it, there are at least 3 outstanding points of disagreement between Iran and the US that are actually surprisingly resolvable. Namely the Strait of Hormuz, the question of sanctions relief, and Iran's nuclear program. Let's start with Hormuz. At first glance, this looks like a real sticking point. Iran is apparently insisting on maintaining, quote, control over the strait after the war, which presumably means continuing to impose tolls on passing ships, while the US, and to be fair most other countries, consider this unacceptable. But we don't think this is as much of an obstacle as it first appears, for the simple reason that Iran will struggle to, quote, control the strait once the war's over, for at least 2 reasons. First, striking other ships would risk retaliatory action from the US or some other country. This is a cost that Iran is apparently willing to tolerate in the middle of a war. After all, what's one more strike amongst many? But will presumably be less willing to tolerate once the war is effectively over. Second, the Iranians have proved remarkably conscious of global public opinion, hence those Lego propaganda videos, which are clearly intended for a Western audience. This is presumably because Iran knows that Trump's willingness to wage war, and how the rest of the world reacts to it, is to some extent a function of public opinion. It's pretty clear, for instance, that one of the big reasons Trump has leaned towards de-escalation recently is that the war has become increasingly unpopular inside the US. Similarly, America's traditional allies in both Europe and the Middle East have refused to get involved, in large part because the war isn't popular inside those countries, and there's a surprising amount of sympathy towards, if not the regime, then at least ordinary Iranians. The point we're driving at here is that the optics of blocking the strait are all right when it happens in the middle of a war that somebody else started, but pretty terrible in peacetime, and attacking passing ships outside of an active conflict would lose Iran any sympathy it might have won during the conflict. More fundamentally, if Iran were to make its new toll system permanent, its Gulf neighbours would presumably respond by diversifying export routes. This would be time-consuming but doable. The Saudis could lean more on Yanbu and the Red Sea, the UAE on Fujairah, and Iraq more on pipeline exports to Turkey. Anyway, the second issue where we can see a potential landing zone is sanctions. At the moment, Iran is demanding total sanctions relief, and the US is basically saying no, and suggesting a phased relief program to make sure Iran abides by any future commitments. But America's apparent faith in sanctions feels misplaced, because, to put it bluntly, the US has been imposing and escalating sanctions on Iran for basically 2 decades now, and they just haven't really worked. Tactically, they've half succeeded, insofar as they've clearly done damage to Iran's economy. Strategically, however, they've failed. They've failed to coerce meaningful concessions out of the regime, and ordinary Iranians have borne the brunt. Moreover, the efficacy of sanctions will wane further with time, as the Iranian economy becomes more self-sufficient and finds ways to operate outside of Western financial systems.
Today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
Sanctions relief could also be lucrative for both parties, given Iran currently punches well below its weight economically. For context, before the war, Iran's GDP was sitting at about $400 billion, but its oil and gas reserves are roughly equivalent to that of Saudi Arabia, a commodity-based economy with a GDP of about $1 trillion, while its population is about as large and well-educated as Turkey, a non-commodity economy with a GDP of about $1.1 trillion. If Trump secures privileged access for American companies, an idea he's repeatedly floated in negotiations with Ukraine and Russia, sanctions relief could be great for both ordinary Iranians and American business. The third issue on our list is Iran's nuclear program. Again, at first glance, this hurdle looks pretty insurmountable. Trump says he wants zero enrichment, but Iran insists that it has a right to enrich under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and has so far denied outside access to its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, or HEU, which is most likely buried in the tunnel system at Isfahan. Nonetheless, we think this calls for cautious optimism here, because, well, the two sides were apparently making progress towards a new nuclear deal earlier this year, until the Trump administration tried to widen the scope of negotiations to include Iran's proxy network and missile program. According to the Omani foreign minister, for instance, who was mediating the negotiations, Iran agreed to resume IAEA inspections, downblend its existing stockpile of HEU, and stop stockpiling altogether, which would make it basically impossible to build a nuke, all in exchange for retaining its domestic enrichment program, albeit with JCPOA-esque limits. Of course, this fell short of Trump's stated demand that Iran should give up on enrichment entirely, but it's not hard to imagine some sort of fudge here. Most obviously, Iran could agree to temporarily halt all enrichment for a few years, which is something Witkoff and Araghchi apparently considered at the last round of talks. The point we're trying to make is that Iran has proved surprisingly willing to make concessions on its nuclear program, which bodes well for a deal. Furthermore, at least some Iranian policymakers believe that the war has demonstrated that further nuclear deterrents are overrated. After all, Israel and the US are both nuclear states, but this didn't deter Iran from retaliating against them. This was an argument made by Iran's former foreign minister and vice president, Javad Zarif, last month, who suggested Iran should thus offer concessions on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Zarif's argument was predictably rejected by hardliners, but probably reflects how Iranian moderates and reformists are thinking about a deal. So that's why we think a deal in Iran might be more doable than is often assumed. Of course, it's important not to overstate this. There are other outstanding points of contention, like the question of Iran's proxy network, and much will depend on America's ability and willingness to strong-arm Israel. Nonetheless, the point we're trying to make is that there are landing zones available, and the obstacles to a deal are probably more political than substantial. Keeping up to date with stories like these and doing independent journalism requires a lot of constant research across all corners of the internet, and even sometimes calls for international travel. But it's not uncommon that we come across roadblocks, whether that be dubious-looking websites that claim to be safe, dodgy Wi-Fi connections in airports and cafes, or even region-locked articles. We couldn't get by any of these barriers without a trusted VPN. So that's where NordVPN comes into play. That's because NordVPN not only offers you the fastest VPN on the planet, giving you quick and secure streaming wherever you are, but it also keeps you fully safe from all the suspicious corners of the internet. NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro feature is built to protect you by blocking dangerous ads, stopping you from entering malware hosting websites, and running thorough checks on everything you download. If anything is found to be infected and dangerous, the files are removed before they can harm you. But if you're rightfully concerned about your life before NordVPN, they've got you covered. Their dark web monitor will be constantly scanning the seedy underbelly of the internet even when you're not connected to a VPN, and will alert you if any of your old data or passwords have been sold. From there, NordPass will give your old passwords a huge upgrade and keep them all in one place for you to easily and safely manage. In today's world, we couldn't imagine even just existing on the internet without a VPN. So there's no better time to take your internet safety seriously. If your online safety is as important to you as it is to us, simply sign up to NordVPN today. Click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR, and not only will you get a massive discount, but you also get 4 extra months totally free. There's no better time to protect yourself. So once again, that's nordvpn.com/TLDR, and it's completely risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee.